Okay, so welcome to our 14th session. Again, for anybody that's new, this is the IIBA Tampa Bay, and we are working through today probably one of the neatest. I was very excited to do this section, Project Estimating 26 Sprints. This is information that comes from PMI and Safe Scaled Agile Framework. Again, if you don't do safe, it's okay. It's not. I'm just, my background is in lean, so I hit in that direction. But I'm going to touch on just some generic agile concepts, and then we'll go from there. So I'm very excited about doing this presentation. Again, my name is Richard Frederick. This is a course. This information is built around a course that is around business data analytics, the language of data. I teach two classes. One is a requirements class, and one is a project management course. All of these logos represent the industries that are all trying to figure out how to do requirements successfully. So again, I always joke that if you're struggling with requirements, as most people are, you're not alone. So are all these groups. Anyway, so with that, let me go and just kind of touch on very quickly requirements. So all of these courses or these sessions, these lunch and learns, we're really about trying to make business analysts initially better at requirements. They still are. My goal is to present information that is not in the traditional curriculum. I've been a trainer, I've trained lots and lots and lots of business analysts. And the traditional curriculum that we teach for requirements really calls for what we call I call the four fingers or four steps of requirements: elicit, analyze, document, and validate. I teach the traditional approach. I just focus on data. The reason I focus on data mainly today is because of the digital transformation, which really is data. I mean, you can just, that's what it is. Business data analytics, digital transformation, and data all basically are the same thing. So this would be the requirements class. This would be the project management course. And you'll notice that it's color coded. It, again, is traditional in the sense that it covers, instead of the four fingers, five fingers of project management: initiate, plan, execute, control, and close. Or if you're a developer, envision, plan, develop, stabilize, and deploy. However, what makes this particular project management class unique is that it is focused solely on data projects, and the format is from the cross-industry standard process for data mining and machine learning, which is very old. It's not a new concept. It's been around since the mid-90s. Today, the IIBA calls it business data analytics. So I call it business data analytics because that's what they call it. So if your group is looking for a requirements class or a project management class specific to data, give me a call. Let me know. Send me an email. Hook up with me on LinkedIn. So who am I? I owned a software company in the 1990s. We built software robots. Robots are programs that run autonomously without any human intervention, as opposed to a script that requires some human oversight. We integrated all these different types of software programs and built solutions. I started training back in 2005, thinking that, you know, everybody was going to be automated very shortly. It's now 2020, and we're really starting to turn the corner. I think we're getting very close. So some major technology transitions had to happen. We had to transition to big data, and we had to transition to 5G. Once those two technologies fully deploy, and they're happening right now, you're going to see a lot of the world change from a technology standpoint. So all of these things that I'm teaching are going to be, well, they've been relevant since the mid-1990s, and they're going to continue to be relevant, especially the data information, out to the rest of your career. So one of the things that I'm always trying to impress upon people is that the information that I teach is not time sensitive. So everything I teach you isn't going to be obsolete in the next few years. That's what's really cool about it. So you can come back to these materials time and time and time again, and you'll still be able to use them. Again, if you're new, you haven't been here, Cliff just posted in the chat window the 3 ways to connect and become a member of the IIBA Tampa Bay. And please feel free to do that. It's free. So we love the price. And I mean, the IIB is not free, but joining us is free. So here's what we're doing. Each one of these sessions, the goal is to seek to understand. And you'll notice, if you've never been in one of our sessions before, that there are 6 photographs on the right-hand side. They represent the team of the future. I've actually gone in and color-coded them now so that they match the project management agenda. So purple is the business analyst. Yellow represents what I call my, purple represents my business analyst product owner. Yellow represents what I call my Scrum Master project manager. I know in a lot of organizations those are different people, but for my presentation, I'm going to make them the same person. The 2 green photographs with the outlines, the top one is my IT system architect, which we talked about just recently as the data wrangler. And then below that person is my developer or data scientist or subject matter expert, or all 3. That could be one person who does all 3 of those. Underneath that, in blue, the blue outline, that is my QA test person. And then finally, at the bottom is a blue image with an orange outline, and that represents intelligent assistance. And that is what all of these lunch and learns are about, which is how do we as business analysts develop intelligent assistance to help the institution operate more efficiently, to help the machine run better, faster, cheaper. This particular section, we're going to talk about project estimating. And I think it's fascinating that we don't really teach business analysts very much information about project estimating in the traditional curriculum. I mean, it's a component of project management training, but it's usually not a component of business analysis training. And I always felt like, as an instructor who does both, I felt like it's really important for business analysts and project managers to have a lot of overlapping information, because in many instances, it's the same person. So I don't think there's anything that's mutually exclusive from one group to the other, but I do think there are some different skill sets. That's for another day. But in this particular day, I want to focus on estimating, which is really forecasting or predicting the future. We covered previously Waterfall versus Agile, but I want to come back and revisit that again and talk about what I call the 4 dimensions of assembly. So we're going to talk about Waterfall Assembly, Agile Assembly. We're going to talk about sizing user stories to build a product backlog. We're going to talk about story points, rules of thumb. And then I'm going to talk just very quickly about this concept of 26 sprints. And then finally, we're going to get in and to talk about what I call the 3 planning stages, which is really fascinating that most of us are led to believe that there's only one planning stage, when really we should be thinking about 3 planning stages. So I'm going to go through that process. Okay, so let me start off with this slide right here. This is kind of where we're heading. You'll notice that there's really an image on the left, and you'll see the image, it looks like a funnel on its side, and it is in a way. And it says at the top of the slide, or at the top of the image, it says uncertainty versus project management lifecycle stage. And then underneath in bright red, so you can see it, it says increment 0, which that is an agile terminology. We don't normally use that terminology in Waterfall, but that's okay. We're mixing it up for this class, which is good. I want people to sort of see that they don't have to be done separately. If you're an analyst or a project manager and you're having to deal with a hybrid environment, this is for you. Okay. To the right, you'll see what looks like a target with a bell-shaped curve in it, and that really represents prediction in the form of eventually Monte Carlo analysis, which is a form of regression or prediction. All right. So our mission here is to kind of take you conceptually from an initiating stage of a project or an idea, and to sort of just discuss what it means to work through the initial estimate or forecast of the future. You know, I tell everybody the two hardest things that I've run across as an instructor and as an advocate, or, you know, a practitioner of both project management and business analysis. The two most difficult things. Number one, as a business analyst, the hardest thing we can do is requirements. Absolutely very difficult. And as a project manager, the hardest thing that I tell people you have to do is estimate. Why? Because with estimating, you're trying to predict the future. With requirements, it's about language discrepancies between human beings, you know, and the idea that there's this natural language is ambiguous. So that's the challenge of requirements. But with estimating, it's all about predicting the future. And I think it's fascinating that people act like it's no big deal to estimate, and then I'll ask them, well, I guess you've won the lottery recently. Because I always ask my students, how many of you raise your hand if you won the lottery? And no one ever raises their hands. And I'm like, okay, well, that's what estimating is. It's trying to predict the future, which is also known as forecasting. Okay, so in order to really do it effectively, now, again, I have to kind of set this up. I'm going to give you the viewpoint of someone who sold custom software. Okay, so this is the viewpoint of a vendor coming in, dealing with a client. You might be the client, and having to communicate effectively with a chief financial officer. So this may not fit the way you guys estimate in your shop today, but that's okay. I'm just giving you the experience of what it's like to go deal with chief financial officers and try to convince them to spend money on custom software, which is not easy. Okay, so let's get back to the first thing you got to do is just kind of wrap your brain around this concept of assembly, and that there's 4 dimensions of assembly. And we've talked in the past about requirements being intellectual property assets that you can assemble into solutions. And they're only intellectual property assets after you've created them. So there's 2 parts. There's before you've created them the first time, which is creation. And then once you've created them, if you set them up for reuse, then they become an assembly part. So that's the idea. So again, I'll try to touch on a little bit of both as we go through this process. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that we've already created them and now they're in inventory. So what are the 4 things that we're trying to assemble? Well, first are the parts. And this is the scope dimension. How long is it going to take to assemble them? This is your schedule dimension. How complex is each part and the whole assembly process? This is your risk dimension. And then how much you're going to spend? This is your cost dimension. Excuse me. So really, technically, for most of us, there's really just 2 types of assembly as a methodology. There's waterfall, which I'm only going to just show this one slide. And if you were in the previous session when we talked about this, the way you remember waterfall versus agile is that in waterfall, your scope drives your schedule, meaning you figure out what you want to create at the beginning, the whole thing, and then you break everything down into its smallest discrete individual assets called work packages. And then what you do is you assign due dates to each of those, and then that lays out a schedule for you. Okay. Risk is when you come in after you've laid out what you're going to build and your schedule, and you identify things that could go wrong with each work package. Oh, if this doesn't happen or if that doesn't happen, then these things occur. You have the risk statement, if then else. And that then adds what's known as contingency reserve to your project schedule. So you have basically what's called a project, like a project budget, and then a contingency reserve budget, and then those add up together to give you a total overall project amount, like what it is that you're going to be spending or how long you're going to take. All right, but most of us have transitioned or are transitioning away from waterfall to agile. So what I want to do is kind of talk about it from an agile perspective. So we're going to spend more time on the agile side here. So I showed this previously, and the way to think about agile is that with Agile, your schedule drives your scope, meaning you're still going to go through a process where you have a roadmap that's structured. And again, I'm going to touch on this slide. Here in bright red, it says increment 0. I want you to remember this because now everything we're going to be talking about is increment 0. So during increment 0, which is kind of an Agile term, you're setting aside maybe a sprint, a 2-week, if your company operates on sprints, and that's the example I'm going to use. You might set aside the first 2 weeks of an initial sprint, and you just call it increment 0, and that's your planning sprint. And in that planning sprint, you're going to go through and build a roadmap of all the things that you're going to want to build, your vision, your themes, your feature or scope or epic or use case, however your organization likes to describe this kind of scope work. And then you're going to break that down into transactions in the form of user stories or tasks or activities that get then fed into a database that's called a backlog. Now, what happens is, as you're breaking out this information and breaking it down, you're discussing amongst your team how complex it's going to be to produce each of these pieces into some sort of minimum viable product, okay? So you're not having to build the whole solution up front. What you're trying to do is build something that operates. What's the smallest thing that you can build that operates, that you can deploy right away, okay? Like prototyping, very much like a prototyping mindset. Anyway, once you get in and you break things down and you put them into your backlog, then you're going to have within your sprint scenario, you'll come up with your sprint plan, and then you actually execute your sprint, which then goes through a process of, during running your sprint, you're going to do daily stand-ups and come back. And then from those stand-ups, you're going to decide how to groom your backlog or decide where you're going to continue to reprioritize. And then eventually you get to where you can demonstrate your MVP, your minimum viable product, and then you might have a review against that, and then that drives more user stories or transactions in the form of a retrospective back into your backlog, and your whole process starts again. All right. But now you have to estimate. So how does all this work? Well, like I said, in the traditional waterfall, the way you did it was you broke everything down, you put a duration amount or an effort amount. Most people call effort duration, but they really are different things. The term really is effort. Effort is, how much time is it going to take to do this piece of work, whatever that piece of work is. There's no schedule against it. Once you add schedule against it, then it becomes duration. But just the basic concept of how long does this take to do a piece of work. And then later on, you come back and you decide how risky it is. What's the risk factor involved with this? Agile is very different. Agile doesn't look at work that way. Agile says, here's something that you want to build in the form of a user story or a requirement. And as a collection, as a group, individually and collectively, we're going to assign a number that's called a story point to each item that we identify as a piece of work. And the numbering system operates on what's known as a Fibonacci scale. It's not a true Fibonacci, it's kind of a modified Fibonacci, but it goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, and 100. Okay, so it's Fibonacci up until the point of 13, and then 20, 40, 100 are just kind of generic numbers. Now, if you look to the right, you'll see there's this little graph out there, and what that does is those numbers kind of fit into this graph, and it's a compilation of how long is it going to take, which they call time intensity, and build complexity, which really represents either the number of steps or the number of decisions, things of that nature. So something that is very easy and is going to take almost no time at all to build gets a 1, and something that's very complex and may take a lot of iterations and a lot of work is 100. So again, 1 is easy, 100 is very difficult to build. Now, that information alone is useful for a lot of teams in a transactional environment, in an operating environment, in a DevOps environment, where you're just trying to stay on top of the work on a weekly basis, okay? But my challenge was always to have to explain this to a financial person, because their needs are very different. And when I explain this, what I'm going to explain today, it's going to feed into what I'm going to come back and explain next week, which is portfolio management, agile portfolio management. So what I'm teaching you today is really going to feed into that for next week. Okay, so let's talk about that. So this slide generates a lot of controversy. not intentionally, but it does, because there's a lot of opinions about story points, and in particular that story points are valueless. And so, but when you're talking to a financial person, is it the developers that determine the estimates, how long it takes, how do the VAs contribute? It really depends on your shop. So technically, you can have your whole shop come together, and when I say your shop, it could be your team, a group of teams. I mean, I can't, speak to your individual experience, but everybody involved gets involved. We're going to talk about that. That's called expert judgment. So hang on to that. I'm going to come to that here in 1 second. But when you're sitting down with a financial person and you tell them story points have no value, the look on their face is like, what? They don't want to hear that. So here's just something that, and again, you can adjust this to fit your shop, but this makes some sense to a financial person, okay? And I'm going to explain it like I'm talking to you as my CFO. Here's the way we look at the world. We said that a 2-week sprint represents 10 business days. And we have arbitrarily decided that one person can complete 5 story points per day, or 25 story points per week, or 50 points per sprint. Okay, now, again, this number is completely arbitrary. We made it up. And I mean, if like the other numbers, if story points are valueless, then it doesn't really matter what number you assign to it, right? So we made up that number. So this isn't written anywhere that, oh yeah, this is exactly what this means. No, this is trying to explain it to someone who's financial. So 5 story points times 5 people, let's say on your team, times 10 days equals a velocity of roughly 250 story points for the sprint. So then I got to ask, well, what is a story point? Well, figure a story point's probably 1.5 hours of labor, and 5 story points represents 7.5 hours of labor. Great. Again, just a way to put some sort of value against story points. And the reason it's controversial is because a lot of people are adamant that they don't want to do that. The developers don't want to put value against story points, that it doesn't benefit them. And I'm like, okay, I don't disagree with that, but there are people who sign checks who want to know. So again, communicating, and for those of you that are transitioning from waterfall to agile, or a hybrid shop, you've got both, and you're always going to have both. One of the things that I'm always trying to impress upon people is 2 weeks is a, if you look at a 52-week calendar year, if you look at sprints as being 2 weeks each, then really what you're looking at is 26 sprints. And what that means is, as you start mapping out all of your work over the course of your fiscal year, you can use these structures to help your work flow through your shop more efficiently, in a way that your financial people will begin to understand. So one of the things that I'm always talking about is the first 2 weeks of the year is sprint number 1. And then the second 2 weeks is sprint number 2. And then the following 2 weeks is sprint number 3. All the way around to, we're coming up to sprints, the last sprints of the year. 26, 25, 24, 23, just kind of working backwards. And that always is the same. That never changes. So the work, then you don't have all these projects that are always on sprint 1 or sprint 2. You can always see when the work begins based on whatever sprint number you've decided to assign to it. Now, again, this is just a suggestion, not saying that you got to do it this way, but I talked to a lot of financial people, and this is kind of the information that they're looking for. They need more structure. So however you guys want to produce it or present it to your management, that's your approach, but I'm just giving you a little piece of information. All right, now coming back to who's involved and how does this all work? All right, so at that first slide where I wrote increment 0 in bright red, and it looked like the funnel going to the target, and I said there's 3 planning stages. All right, this is really important. This is probably the main thing that I hope you take away from this today. There's a tendency to think that the very first time you get together and estimate a piece of work, that's it, that's the estimate. And really, that doesn't benefit you if your mission is to train intelligence. So what you got to do is think in terms of, how does estimating train intelligence? That's the question. So in order for estimating to actually train intelligence, you have to recognize that the purpose of a plan is to measure actual. You see, intelligence doesn't work unless there's both actual and plan. You got to have both together, meaning you have your plan that you come up with, and then you have to have your actual to measure variance, and that is what enables intelligence to do forecasting. And later on, I'm going to teach you earned value and explain how all of this works, just on a operational basis. I'll show you, I'll teach you what's called earned value EZ, and show you how you can do forecasts from status based on gathering actual data. All right, now, remember that planning is about forecasting. So when you're planning, you're trying to forecast in the future. And planning really goes through 3 phases. The first stage or phase is called discovery. And that's your rough order of magnitude or your ROM estimate. Let me just tell you what all 3 phases are. There's discovery, there's iterative, and there's baseline, okay? Discovery is kind of, where you're starting, and then iterative, you're gonna do other estimating techniques, and then finally you're gonna get to baseline, which is your final approach. All right, so I'm gonna walk you through each of them individually. So with discovery, it's called the rough order of magnitude and experience. It's experience-based, meaning these estimates are gonna come from your staff. So the question that Grace had was, is it developers that do the estimates or the BAs? Everybody can be involved in the process. Everybody is a subject matter expert in their job titles. So if you bring value to this discussion, then you should be in the room. That's kind of how I look at it. So if you were to go through the project management body of knowledge, and there's 47 different processes that you go through, probably 80% of them all begin with the word expert judgment. What that means is you're going to people and you're asking about both their implicit experience and implicit data, meaning all of us have implicit experience and implicit data that we bring to discussions. All right, now, to take that information and to put numbers against it, something was created called planning poker, and this is where you use your Fibonacci scale to identify complexity of each of the user stories that you're going to estimate. All right. And so all I did was add value information to your Fibonacci scale, to your planning poker estimates, to give management a rough idea of how long we think things are going to take. Okay, that's all we're doing here. So we always begin with expert judgment, and in Agile we add this complexity, which really is a risk number. That's really what that means. The lower number, the lower the risk, the higher the number, the higher the risk. Also, at this stage of planning, you're not really using hard data to come up with information. This is a custom, we call this cost plus custom projects. These are very expensive because, like custom clothing, they're completely unique. All right. Once you've done a project, once you've started building a project, let's assume that you're working from a clean sheet of paper, you've never done it before, you're going to go through this process the first time. Great. Now that you've actually started the process and you've finished planning and now you're actually in the execution process, if you're accounting for the data that you're accumulating from the actual process, then that data gets stored in your repository, your database, that allows you to then go back and measure or forecast against that actual data. Okay, that's earned value. The second phase of planning So the first phase of planning is you get together as a group and you come up with some ideas. You say, great. The second phase of planning is where you take that information that you just elicited from your group in your planning session, and now you go and you either break it down into more detail, and you can see what I call the mountain of work is the vision, roadmap, portfolio, program, project. And you break everything into its maximum amount of detail, and then you roll all that data up to see what kind of final numbers come up. Now understand, and this is the thing that I'm always trying to explain to people at the project level, is that a lot of times those of us working at the project level, we're not aware of the upper levels because we're not in those meetings. But if you've been in those meetings, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that the higher up you go, the more detailed information drives, these larger amounts at the very top. So you need to be aware of this. The generic project management group might be happy with just the expert judgment and the planning poker and to begin to build up your backlog. Great. Now that you have a backlog, you have a database, and that database can be used to then compare future projects that you're working on against something that you've done in the past. That's called a database. I just call it a database. It's called a historical analogous estimate, but I put the word database in there because I want you to think in terms of, oh yeah, we have a database of work from the past that we can compare work that we're either going to do, that we're going to do in the future, and just see how that works out. Okay, so again, I have the mountain of work. That's bottom-up estimating, where you're starting at the bottom and all the data is rolling up. And then underneath that, I show kind of this folders, and then a kind of a hard drive symbol, and then a magnifying glass looking at the future, trying to predict the future. And it says using historical data to predict the future. And the black arrow is pointing directly at intelligence. This is where intelligence begins to, the more data that you begin to accumulate, the smarter your intelligence becomes in its ability to predict the future. This has been the case from the very beginning of this courses. So you started off with the, just pure expert judgment, then planning poker. Then you went and you added here's some implicit experience. Again, hey, yeah, we did that project before, but now you've got some explicit data in our database. Great. Then that leads us to the ultimate, which is the baseline. And the second phase is called iterative. Oh, let me go back and explain that too. The reason it's called iterative planning is because once you get this information, you're going to go back to your stakeholders, whomever they are, and validate it. So you're going to validate a lot of what you're learning as you're going through your process. So the theory is you start with custom, and then you go back to your database and you say, hey, have we done something similar to that? Maybe we don't want it to be 100% custom. Yes, we've done something similar, and we want to make this very detailed and kind of look at it and compare it to something in the past. Then we go back to our stakeholders, we validate that. That's the iterative part of it. Then we feel pretty good that we have some good information that we're going to move forward with to start building. Okay. Then the last step is called baseline, and baseline is when it gets validated with your decision makers. And believe it or not, a lot of business analysts go into the portfolio tool. So next week we're going to talk about the portfolio tool, and the first thing that you use to drive a record into a portfolio is a business case. So this baseline information a lot of times is the business case that then feeds the portfolio tool. All right. Now, if you're not in that environment and guys don't work that way, don't worry about that today. But just understand that as we move from the planning estimate to the baseline definitive estimate, now we're moving into very much a forecasted data model. And we need that to do, we call that fixed price assembly, to do really good prediction. The more we've set up the work to be assembly, the easier it is to predict the outcome. The more work is set up as custom, where it's based on just the humans that are available or not available, and there's a lot of questions about our resources, and we're not really sure how long things are going to take. Obviously, that's less predictable with more risk. Okay, so management wants more predictability. I'll just tell you right up front. So designing your estimates to ultimately feed intelligence is going to present management, senior management, with more predictability. That's what they're looking for. So I call this really two types of estimates. So the first one was expert judgment and planning poker, and then the second one was bottom up and historical analogous estimates. This one is, I'm just calling it data warehouse, parametric estimating, which then leads to Monte Carlo analysis, which is your intelligent assistance. So the theory is that maybe in the historical analogous estimate, you only had one project that you'd done that was similar to the one you're working on. In this particular model, you've got dozens, maybe hundreds of projects that are similar to the one that you're working on. And in that scenario, you can start to look at a best case, worst case, most likely. What Monte Carlo does is it uses the computer to then match that to basically every kind of probability that you can think of for the project to create a huge range of possible outcomes. And this is where the data needs to be available historically so that your intelligent assistant can start to look at and help you identify which projects need to be prioritized over other projects. And see, that's one of the things that the project team isn't thinking about. They're thinking about prioritizing the work itself, but maybe not the projects themselves. That usually is handled at a higher level. So next week, we're going to talk about how projects get selected along something called the efficient frontier. I'll get there next week, but let me sum this up because I'm running out of time. As you get to this third phase of baseline, what you're really looking at now is explicit experience and explicit data, because you've got it all in your data warehouse. And as you move in this direction, it becomes far more predictable and less uncertain. So let me wrap all this up into kind of a nutshell. Waterfall, the advantage of Waterfall, and again, this is not saying that Waterfall is better than Agile. It's not. It's just the advantage of Waterfall is that there's generally more data associated with the work. That's it. What that enables, though, is better, calculations and decisions and projections out into the future. Okay, that's the one kind of benefit. What we just talked about was being able to take traditional Agile, which I don't even know if you can say that. That sounds like an oxymoron because it's so new. If you take Agile and you give it some level of value, then that enables you to do the very same thing that Waterfall does. So now all of a sudden, it's like, oh, okay, so Waterfall, yeah, we had all this data with Waterfall, but we have similar data we can create with Agile. Okay, we can make story points into values, and we can set all this up across a fiscal year and begin to provide management with some level of forecastable deliverables beyond just MVPs that they get every 2 weeks. Okay, now I don't know if that makes sense or not, but does that make sense? Did I make sense to everybody or not? Sometimes what I'm thinking and what comes out are different. The idea here, and let me show you what I mean by this. Let me explain what I mean by this. If you look at the funnel, the funnel says that in the beginning, the range of possible solution amounts is all over the place. But as you move through time, as you start iterating through your process, your estimating skills get tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, and your ability to predict the future becomes more certain, because a lot of things, we call them unknown unknowns, start to become knowns. So this is exactly what this whole presentation was about, was trying to enable you to communicate effectively to your CFO. That was the whole thing. And any of you who've been in my presentations before, you know that that's the mission, is to help you as a business analyst talk to your chief financial officer. So, all right. So let me go back and talk about what we just did. So again, project estimating is forecasting, predicting the future. Next week, we're going to talk about portfolio management and how what we just talked about this week is going to feed into that. We talked about 4 dimensions of assembly, which is the same no matter what. It's always going to be scope, schedule, risk, and cost. Those four are, no matter what kind of project you're working on, those are 4 dimensions. Whether it's waterfall or agile, you got to take it, you have to factor into your planning, okay? Then we talked about 3 planning stages. And again, whether you're waterfall or agile, you can go through 3 planning stages. So when someone said to me, well, how do you do that? I said, you just set it up to go through it in 2 weeks. And they said, well, what if you don't have it set up? I said, exactly, that's the purpose. One of your plans for yourself or your staff is to set up an estimating system that can move you through all 3 phases within 2 weeks' time. Again, it's another project that needs to be on your plan. And see, this is the thing, as a business analyst and or project manager, one of the projects that I'm always telling project managers and analysts to do is set up projects that make your shop more efficient in the way that it operates. So the goal is to try to get everything done, no matter what it is, in 2 weeks or less. People say to me, well, can you do that? And I'm like, well, if you design it for that, you'll cut out the parts that aren't necessary and you'll focus on the parts that are. The first time you do it, you're not going to be very good at it. Obviously, you probably won't make it in a 2-week period. But if your goal is to get there, it might take you a year. It might take you 26 sprints of planning, of practice, to finally get to where you got all of it into one nice package that you can leverage your database to generate Monte Carlo analysis. And let me repeat that. The mission of your planning as an analyst needs to be able to generate some kind of regression, prediction, calculation. Okay, so if you're just dealing with these estimates from a planning poker standpoint, as an analyst, you need to be thinking about, okay, how do I move this from planning poker into regression? And the most common regression in estimating is Monte Carlo. So, all right, so I'll stop there. Any questions? Have we got any questions at all? Hopefully your heads didn't explode. They will next week, though. Any things? No. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate your time, and we're going to call this here. And hopefully you'll be on next week to understand and learn about Agile portfolio management. So that's a very interesting, very interesting topic as well. So thank you again for your time, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Richard.